Hello, everyone. It's been a while. Um, I'm reading this little book by Nora Horn titled Everybody Loves Dead Jews. I'll come back to it in a little bit, in a couple of minutes. But I've been following many smart, sapient Lebanese on social media, and many of whom seem to be still persuaded that Israel, the modern state of Israel, was a religious project, that Zionism's determination to resolve the Jewish question, a 3,000-year-old story of Jew hatred, that they were intent on resolving that Jewish problem by reestablishing Jewish sovereignty on the Jews' ancestral home, and that project itself was a biblical enterprise, that it was built on a biblical promise, the promised land, if you will. And one of those smart, sapient Lebanese, a well-respected francophone journalist, wrote me recently in a tweet that he has since deleted, so I could not respond to it because it no longer exists. But he writes, and I quote, "When God is the source of legitimacy for your people, or when God is the source of legitimacy of your power, when you are chosen," and he puts chosen in quotation marks, "the only justice you ought to expect by default is the justice that God gives you." This end of quote. This implies that modern Israel is not legitimate, biblically speaking, and it ought to be dismantled, of course, because it's not legitimate. And ironically, he is right. I do not disagree at all with that bit. Um, not with the dismantlement bit, but with the divine intervention bit. So he is right. For Israel to be legitimate, God, not man, has to bring it justice. Except that modern Zionism and its determination to reestablish Jewish sovereignty on the Jews' ancestral land, modern Zionism does not draw its legitimacy from religious texts, but rather from a historical experience. In fact, this is the very same reasons, the religious reason, that's the reason why some Haredi Jews and the Neturei Karta, for instance, utterly reject modern Israel, impugn its political legitimacy, and even seek to dismantle it. Um, this is so not because they don't believe in the redemption of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland, but because they believe that this redemption, this restitution, has to be the handiwork of God, not a man made project as Zionism is. In fact, the Neturei Karta folks deem modern political Zionism to be a disruption of God's divine plan. God, who alone, he and with his divine wand, will redeem the Jews to their ancestral homeland. So that claim, drawing on scriptures to delegitimize a state member of the United Nations and incidentally co-author, along with Lebanon, ironically, co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Um, so this delegitimation does make sense, if you will, if you're reading scripture, but it does not hold water if scripture is how you define and understand Zionism. Uh, but this inversion of reality does have echo in Muslim quarters, since Islam, by and large, certainly the Hamas iterations of Islam, view the struggle as one with religious bearings, pitting believers against non believers, more specifically Muslims against Jews. Yet again, Zionism was the Zionism that established. There are many different Zionisms. Zionism is a family name, but the Zionism that established the modern state of Israel is a national project, not a religious project. But as Nora Horn's book title suggests, people love dead Jews, and Jews will gain acceptance and legitimacy and sympathy, if you will, again when they're no longer in Israel, and preferably when they're dead, like Anne Frank. And she uses Anne Frank as one of the opening chapters of the book. This is how we love Jews, because Anne Frank is dead. I say this because I'm also reading a 1968 little book by Raymond Aron, one of the most prominent French intellectuals of the 20th century. And that tiny little book, about 100 pages or so, is titled De Gaulle, Israël et les Juifs. De Gaulle, Israel, and the Jews. It was published in 1968, and I'll come to it in a little bit. But before doing so, I should mention briefly that in 1947, there was a conversation between Charles de Gaulle and Claude Guy, who was his aide de camp during World War II. During this conversation, Claude Guy reports the general having confided in him in the following terms, and I quote, De Gaulle says, relative to this business of Palestine, I must admit that my preference goes to the Jews. You see, the Arabs are not worthy of our help. This is De Gaulle, right? I'm not saying this, okay? This is De Gaulle's quote. You see, the Arabs are not worthy of our help. They're too skittish. In 1930, during my first visit to Palestine, I remember having seen the orange groves tended by the Arabs. They produced a fruit that was all shriveled up, bitter, tiny. The Jews, on the other hand, grew their oranges remarkably successfully. These committed individuals, doubtlessly due to the fact that they were imbued in the sentiment that they were tilling their own ancestral lands, those folks were eager to work in the most punishing of conditions, on the most inhospitable of fields. During the Second World War, when I returned to Palestine, I was stunned by the progress that the Jews had made barely a decade following my first visit. It was nothing short of miraculous. Here is in brief, this is how I end the quote ends, here is in brief why we must help the Jews and why we ought to make haste helping them, because anti-Semitism in its most virulent form will doubtlessly rear its ugly head again and will do so rather quickly. End of quote. This was Charles de Gaulle, 1947. But here's the rub. De Gaulle would completely change course a mere 20 years later in 1967 and utter, borderline anti-Semitic discourse. Right after 1967, this is right after Israel had pulverized three mighty Arab armies in what is known in some quarters as the June War, and in some other quarters as the Six-Day War. So, from a sympathizer of the Zionists and the Zionist cause, when the Jews were the underdog, de Gaulle would morph a mere 20 years later into not only a critic, but again, as I said, a borderline anti-Semite. And he would describe the Jews thusly as un peuple d'élite, sûr de lui-même et dominateur. A chosen people, an elite people, self-assured and dominating. A sententious, if you will, declaration in line of things that de Gaulle would say, but a phrase that was deemed anti-Semitic in many French quarters at the time. He would reject that characterization, but he would stick by it. And he would argue that it was a compliment. He was paying the Jews a compliment. In reality, I don't think it was anti-Semitic. It was simply de Gaullian. He was obsessively pompous and sententious in his certitudes, but it revealed perhaps a certain exasperation, if you will, with the Jew who now in 1967 was no longer the underdog, was no longer dead. And so this, in a way, confirms Dara Horn's boutade that people love dead Jews. That same year, in 1967, the year Israel ceases being an underdog, and on the heels of this combustive phrase of Charles de Gaulle, un peuple d'élite sûr de lui-même et dominateur, de Gaulle would have a conversation with his private physician who happened to be Jewish, Ady Steg was his name. He would have this very brief conversation during which he would tell him, I mean, what's going on? Why did this happen? Why did Israel pulverize these Arab states? And he would tell him during that conversation, vous, you all, the Jews, vous êtes si beaux dans vos psaumes. Vous êtes si beau dans votre liturgie. You're so beautiful in your psalms. You are so beautiful in your liturgy. What happened? So Stag would reply, et nous sommes si beaux crucifiés. And we are so beautiful also crucified. That is exactly what you're saying, he tells the general. C'est ce que cela veut vous dire. Les goyim s'énervent quand nous ne sommes plus des juifs courbés, des juifs de ghetto, des juifs de cour. C'est pourquoi ils n'aiment pas les Israéliens. Ce ne sont pas de vrais juifs. Ils sont tout droits. So he tells him, and we're also very beautiful crucified. And that's essentially what you are saying, my general. The goyim are angry when we are no longer Jews with bent backs, when we are no longer Jews of the ghettos, when we are no longer court jester Jews. And that is why they do not like Israelis, because the Israelis are not real Jews. They stand up straight. So there you have it. Thank you.